It was the festival of the Sementivai, an important rustic festival ritually celebrating the day of sowing seeds, semen, ensuring the fertility of the land, the health of the crops, and ultimately the abundance of the harvest. The Roman author and polymath Varro tells us he bumped into his father-in-law and some of his friends on the way to the temple. They were examining a map of Italy which was painted on the wall. One of the friends posed a question. "You've all travelled through many lands," he said. "Have you seen any land more fully cultivated than Italy?" And so begins a conversation on the topic. After talking about the difficulties of cultivating the terrain in other places, the harshness of the climate, the long dark winters, the lack of sunlight, the frozen seas of the north, Varro's father-in-law exclaims, "Do you think that anything can germinate in such a land, or mature if it does germinate? How can anything there be planted or grow or be harvested?" Then, in considering the temperate climes of Italy by contrast, he continues, "On the other hand, what useful product is there which not only does not grow in Italy, but even grow to perfection? What spelt shall I compare to the Campanian? What wheat to the Apulian? What wine to the Falernian? Or what oil to the Venafran? Is not Italy so covered with trees that the whole land seems to be an orchard?" Varro's father-in-law has just made a statement about Italy and its fertile abundance that ancient Romans loved to think about, talk about, represent in their art, present at their banquet tables, and of course, consume. The happy perfection of the Italian soil and climate and the delicious flavours of fresh Italian produce was a point of pride for ancient Romans. And for the elite and landed gentry, yet another occasion to compete with one another and show off. We've spent the past 3 episodes in the terrain of war, and we've seen that bloodshed and the battlefield was deep set in the cultural psyche and the Roman worldview, and we've seen that the deities presiding over these domains in many ways characterize our own mental image of Rome. Certainly the image of the legions valiantly upholding justice and defending Rome's borders and military and political supremacy was propagated far and wide in ancient times. But so was this image, this delightful picture of verdant, burgeoning fields. And so we shift our focus now from deities of war to deities of sustenance. We've already seen, if you remember, that the two are not entirely disconnected. We discussed Mars, for example, in episode 12 and saw that he was as much a god of agriculture as war. And we saw that there was a connection there between the rustic ideal of this farmer citizen tending his land and going off to war when required to defend it, the cultivated fields, in that case a prize won and guarded by arms, and this image of the whole of Italy so blessed with fruitful trees that the whole land seems to be one giant orchard was part ideology, part pride, and, as continues to be the case today, part truth. The beauty of Italian fields and the gastronomic delights they offer are a large part of what the multitudes of tourists to the country still come to experience. The first of our gods of sustenance is accordingly a deity of the orchard, a goddess who embodies all the loveliness of ripe and fruitful trees, and a goddess who therefore embodies much of the Roman good life, a goddess of wholesome, simple pleasures. The Latin for orchard is pomarium, and the goddess we visit in this episode is called Pomona. She ushers us into our segue from war to sustenance because the poet Ovid describes her like this. She cared not for the forests or the streams, but loved the country and the boughs that bear delicious fruit. Her right hand never felt the weight of a spear. She always loved to hold a sharp, curved pruning knife, with which she would at one time cut back the luxuriant growth, or at another time lop the straggling branches. In other words, her weapons of choice were gardening tools. And it's interesting that Ovid chose to emphasize that her hand had never held instruments of war. I think that's no coincidence. Part of her charm is her calm, generous, and peaceable nature. She stands in stark contrast, then, to deities such as the war goddess Bellona. The contentments of the orchard are a world apart from the brutalities of the battlefield. So now, happily, we follow her lead. And we too leave behind the violence, lay down the swords and spears, and pick up the pruning knife to enter the realm of Pomona. Pomum is the Latin for fruit, the kind of stone fruit that grows on trees and orchards. It's the origin of the French pomme, for apple. And Pomona is the personified spirit of fruit trees and the guardian of the orchard bounty. In the Roman world, these included all the succulent treats of summer, such as apples, pomegranates, pears and plums, olives and grapes, figs and quince, cherries and peaches. Pliny the Elder, Rome's great natural historian, after expounding the medical properties of various grains and flowers, moves on to the medicinal properties of fruit, stating that their rival in bounty is Pomona, who even to hanging fruits has given healing qualities. For the entire chapter, he refers to the healing qualities of various fruits as being the gifts of Pomona. Not being content to protect and to nourish with the shade of her trees, he says. It's as though she was vexed at the thought of there being more help in things further away from heaven and coming into use later. For the earliest food of man, she called to mind, had come from trees. In this way, he had been led to gaze at the heavens, and he could still obtain his food from herself, without recourse to the crops of the field. This is a really interesting statement from Pliny about his visions of early humankind, and I'm surprised there hasn't been more discussion about it. What Pliny intuits here is that it was the primordial bounty of trees that sustained people before the introduction of farming and cultivating land for crops. By simply looking at the fruit in the trees, the gaze was naturally also therefore drawn to the heavens, and in this heavenward gaze of the early fruit pickers, there Pliny perceives Pomona. He goes on to put words in her mouth. Man, she says, enjoys through me a very great amount of pleasure. It is I who create the juice of the grape and the oil of the olive, I who create the dates and fruits and great variety. I am unlike Mother Earth, all of whose gifts must be earned by toil, ploughing by bulls, beating on threshing floors, and then grinding between millstones, and all to produce food at some indefinite time and with immense labour. But my gifts are perfect before they leave me, and need no laborious preparation. They proffer themselves unasked, and if it be too much trouble to reach them, they actually fall off by themselves. So Pliny has an almost Eden-esque sense here of a world before the yoking of people to the land and the effort and toil involved in cultivating and maintaining it. These fruits are not forbidden, of course, quite the opposite. They're so generously on offer that if even the task of plucking them from the tree proves too much work, they simply fall off when they're ripe, and people strolling about at leisure just have to bend down to pick them up. Because they not only taste delicious but also have medicinal properties, Pliny writes that Pomona has striven to outdo herself in that she has created more for our benefit even than for our pleasure. Now, his medical advice is not something you'd want to follow, but it is enormously entertaining and gives all sorts of slices of life via medical issues and the things that people ail from. He provides the recipe, for example, of a concoction made from bitter pomegranate juice, which he recommends for affectations of the mouth, nostrils and ears, for dimness of vision, for sores on the eyelid, for the genitals, for so-called corroding sores and excrescences on ulcers, and to counteract the poison of sea hares. So I had no idea what sea hares were, and I had to go and look them up. But the Lepus marinus, meaning literally sea hare, turns out to be some sort of hermaphroditic sea slug that moves about by turbojet propulsion and squirts out a kind of toxic ink if threatened. It isn't harmful to humans by the sound of it, though, and I have no idea why Pliny is concerned about them or what he thinks pomegranate juice is going to cure. On the other hand, in medieval times, there was some kind of legendary beast that also went by the same name, Lepus marinus, that in some old encyclopedias actually looks like a sea hare and, despite looking ridiculous, was apparently thought to be terribly poisonous. So perhaps these are a conflation of things, and perhaps for inexplicable reasons they have an aversion to pomegranates. Anyway, fruits, according to Pliny, have all sorts of marvellous medical uses. Pears, for example, can be used to make some sort of plaster for dispersing flesh lesions, whatever that means precisely, and they also neutralise the poison of toadstools and tree fungi. Fig juice, we are told, has the property of counteracting the poison of hornets, wasps, and similar creatures, especially scorpions, and with axle grease it also removes warts. Boiled in wine and applied, they bring carbuncles to a head. And if you make ash from fig shoots after 2 washings with white lead added, it is worked into lozenges for the treatment of ulcers and scabs on the eyes. I love ancient medical advice. It's often overlooked as a source because it's so off the mark, but it's such a window into the real lived world and culture. So mulberries, if plucked before they begin to bud, and plucked, mind you, only with the left hand, can be worn as an amulet, so long as they've not touched the ground, in which case it will stop any unwanted flow of blood, whether from a wound, Pliny tells us, or the mouth, the nostrils, or from hemorrhoids. If anyone swallows cherries with their stones in the morning when the dew is on them, the bowels will apparently be so relieved that the feet will be quite free from gout. And so on and so forth. These are the many, less celebrated gifts of Pomona. But Pliny's point about the generous abundance of Pomona in terms of her fruits and easy pickings is her abiding image. In myth, she represents more besides. Pomona's orchard is a closed, walled garden, and she herself is a figure of resolute chastity, protecting her fruit from unwelcome pluckers. So the ancient poets tell us her story, which is in the end a love story and one with that rare quality in the world of myth, a happy ending. Ovid tells us that she simply delighted on tending to her trees, watering them, pruning them, and making them flourish. She never felt the least desire of love, Ovid says. But fearful of some rustic's violence, she had her orchard closed within a wall, and both forbade and fled the approach of males. Although she isn't particularly well known now, she was quite the muse for modern artists from the Renaissance through to the Victorian era, and it seems a lot of her intrigue was in these tensions she embodies between beauty and an aversion to the male gaze, fertility and chastity. Despite her modesty and the fact that she didn't want the male gaze upon her, you'll notice a lot of these male painters depict her with her clothes accidentally falling off her in opportune places for no apparent reason. Her very reticence seems to have inspired these sorts of thoughts, which is not unlike what she seems to have inspired in the woodland spirits from what the poets tell us. What did satyrs not do in attempt to gain her love? Asked Ovid, describing those raunchy satyrs dancing for her and trying to seduce her. Pan tried too, looking dashing in his wreath of pine. Silenos also tried his luck to no avail. Pomona seals herself off from the unwanted advances of all these creatures of wildness and abandon. She's cultivated and serene, and in that spirit enjoys her isolation and the fruits of it. However, she also has the attention of Vertumnus, who's an interesting deity in his own right, and will visit him properly later in an episode of his own. But in brief, he represents seasonality and is a god of change. So, as an allegory, you can see the importance of his presence in the context of an orchard, where everything is seasonal and relies on the processes of fruition. Vertumnus was more in love with Pomona than the rest, and more resolute in winning her over, although his advances had been rebuffed just like everyone else's. He was also more crafty, however. Being a god of changeability, he could change form, and so he often visited her disguised as a local farmhand or a worker in the field. Sometimes he passed her by disguised as a soldier, another time as a fisherman. In fact, says Ovid, by means of many shapes he had often obtained access to her and joyed in seeing her beauty. So he was using his disguises simply as a means of gaining access to her orchard and seeing her, but at length he came up with a more proactive plan to win her over. He disguised himself as an old woman. Leaning on a stick with white hair round his temples, he assumed the shape of an old woman, entering so the cultivated garden. He admired the fruit and said, "But you are so much lovelier." And while he praised her, gave some kisses too, Ovid adds, such as no real old lady ever gave. The bent old creature then sat on the grass, gazing at branches weighed down with their fruit of autumn. Opposite them was an elm tree, beautiful with shining grapes, and after he'd praised it, with the vine embracing it, he said, "But only think, if this trunk stood unwedded to this vine, it would have nothing to attract our hearts beyond its leaves. And this delightful vine, united to the elm tree, finds its rest, but, if not so joined to it, would fall down prostrate on the ground. And yet you find no warning in the example of this tree. You've avoided marriage with no wish to be united. I must wish that you would change that, and soon desire it. Helen would not have so many suitors for her hand." He means the Spartan beauty whose face launched 1,000 ships and caused the Trojan War, and he goes on to list other such mythological beauties. "Even now, while you avoid those who are courting you, and while you turn in your disgust, 1,000 suitors want to marry you, the demigods and gods and the deities of Alba's mountain tops. But you, if you are wise and wish to make a good match, listen patiently to me, an old woman. I love you much more than all of them, more than you dream or think. Despise all common persons, and choose now Vertumnus as the partner of your couch. And you may take me as a surety for him. He is not better known even to himself than he is known to me. And he is not now wandering everywhere from here to there throughout the world. He always will frequent the places near here, and he does not, like so many of your wooers, fall in love with she who he happens to have seen the last." Isn't that a great way of describing shallow love and the people whose hearts flit too easily from one to the next? So Vertumnus, in the guise of the old lady, continues, "You are his first and last love, and to you alone he will devote his life. Besides all, he is young and has a natural gift of grace, so that he can most readily transform himself to any wanted shape, and will become whatever you may wish, even though you ask him things unseen before. And only think, have you not the same tastes? Will he not be the first to welcome fruits which are your great delight? And does he not hold your gifts safely in his glad right hand? But now he does not long for any fruit plucked from the tree, and has no thought of herbs with pleasant juices that the garden gives. He cannot think of anything but you. Have pity on his passion, and believe that he who woos you is here, and he pleads with my lips. And then, for good measure, and to add some urgency, he tacks on some threats. You should not forget to fear avenging deity and the Idalian, that's Aphrodite, who hates all cruel hearts, and also dread the fierce revenge of her of Rhamnus land. He means the goddess Nemesis. And that you may stand more in awe of them, old age has given me opportunities of knowing many things. I will relate some happenings known in Cyprus, that's the birthplace of Aphrodite, by which you may be persuaded and relent with ease. And he then goes on recounting a long list of mythological warnings of love lost, love foiled, and love gained. And it's on account of these encouragements that Pomona does indeed relent and give in eventually and succumb to Vertumnus's charms after all, which are anyway genuine, and it seems in the end it was a happy union. Pomona herself, nonetheless, is generally portrayed as reclusive, self-sufficient, and hostile to male advances. Her gardens are protected by hedges and walls, and these are clear metaphors for virginity, self-containment, and cultivated order. Although gentle, Pomona's not rendered passive. She resists intrusion and controls her space. Her eventual yielding is framed not as a defeat or as a result of force, but a transformation by gentle persuasion into mutual cultivation and fruition. Their relationship reflects the tended garden and union of male and female that brings all the fruit to bear. If you wander around Pompeii or Herculaneum, one of the things you'll notice that gives the place its warmth and joie de vivre is that so many of the wall paintings and mosaics depict fruit-laden trees, orchards, baskets of produce, and all the abundance that Pomona provides. It's quite characteristic of Roman art, and you'll see these sorts of images in museums everywhere. Roman ideals about the good life were often based in idyllic rustic scenes where the eye might dance lazily over the dappled beauty of the boughs heavy with ripe fruit, and the table might offer the taste buds the same delights. Sometimes you'll see female figures with baskets or pruning hooks, and though they're not explicitly Pomona, they were evocative of her, and the ubiquity of garden-themed decoration in elite Roman houses shows Pomona's spirit to have been deeply embedded in Roman visual culture. No known temple is recorded in her name, but she likely had altars or cult sites locally in household gardens, villa orchards, and cultivated spaces. She appears in the Indigamenta, which was the pontifical list of divine names to be invoked in ritual, particularly in the context of fruit trees, and she had her own priest, a Flamen Pomonalis, attested in the list of minor priesthoods. This is a significant detail. Even if her public cult was modest, having a Flamen, a priest, meant state-level recognition. So the sanctity of her orchard cultivation was official and an important element of civilized life. Not unlike the posturing of the landed gentry of the English countryside, with all their hounds and horses and who wear their welly boots as status symbols, the Roman elite postured, similarly flaunting the abundance of their country estates, which they wafted around with an enlightened air, sniffing grapes, while the slaves, servants, and peasant farmers did the actual work. Functionally, the productive garden was an important part of the economy of any villa estate, but it was also part of elite self-representation and another area in which they competed to outdo each other, as I mentioned earlier. We can find evidence for this in many places, including the conversation with which we began between Varro and his father-in-law and his friends at the festival for sowing seeds. One of the party is talking about quinces and honey apples and thinking about how to store them after the harvest. He says, "It is thought that all these keep well in a dry and cool place, laid out on straw. For this reason, those who build fruit houses are careful to let them have windows facing the north and open to the wind, but they have shutters to keep the fruit from shriveling after losing its juice when the wind blows steadily. And it's for this reason too, to make it cooler, that they coat the ceilings, walls and floors with marble cement. Some people even spread a dining table in it to dine in there. And, in fact, if luxury allows people to do this in a picture gallery where the scene is set by art, why should they not enjoy a scene set by nature in a charming arrangement of fruit?" So far, that does all sound charming and idyllic. Dining in a rustic building in the countryside full of freshly picked fruit would certainly be a delightful and picturesque way to fritter an afternoon in loveliness. But the speaker then tacks on a caveat that gives the game away and gives us a good sense of how inauthentic and pretentious even this rural simplicity could become. All this is well and good, provided always, he warns, that you do not follow the example set by some of buying fruit in Rome and carrying it to the country to pile it up in the fruit house for a dinner party. It's a brilliant scene when you imagine it, a landowner busy buying up bulk fruit in the city and surreptitiously carting it out to his estate, where it's carefully arranged in his fruit house in the garden to decorate a banquet where all the guests lounge about marvelling at the abundance of his produce. I think it's the ancient equivalent of taking Marks and Spencer's ready meals out of their packets and dishing it up as if you made it. Not that I've ever done that, obviously. But fruit, as I say, wasn't just for aesthetics, it was real and big business. Romans seem to have been quite obsessed with grafting and coming up with new and improved strains, and Pliny tells us that Rome was surrounded by marvellous fruit trees whose produce sells for high sums. A single tree, Pliny claims, yielding a larger return than whole farms used to in the old days. Varro, in his praise of the orchards of one Gnaeus Tremellius Scrofa, a man, he says, distinguished by all virtues, who is esteemed the Roman most skilled in agriculture. And Varro exclaims, "For his estates, because of their high cultivation, are a more pleasing sight to many than the country residences of others furnished in a princely style. When people come to inspect his farmsteads, it's not to see collections of pictures, but collections of fruit." He mentions that at the top of the Via Sacra, which is the sacred way, a street, the main triumphal road, in fact, running through the Forum and on up to the Capitoline, that fruits are sold there outrageously expensively. He compares the vision of their luxuriousness as they're set out at stalls for sale to the sights that you can see growing in Scrofa's orchard. He says, "The top of the Via Sacra, where fruit brings its weight in gold, is the very picture of his orchard." Such orchards and such fruits were not just a matter of individual pride and posturing, though. At a collective level, it all played into the imperial project. Exotic fruits were brought back from conquered lands ever further afield, and new varieties and curiosities were cultivated back in Italy and served up at elite dinners in Rome. We might think of Hercules and his mission to bring back the golden apple from the garden of the Hesperides at the far western edge of the world, where it was tended by the daughters of dusk and jealously guarded by a dragon. If the golden apple had ended up in Rome, it almost certainly would have been dished up at a fancy banquet and eaten. And it's a fact stranger than fiction that all those conquering generals of previous episodes came back in triumph from various corners of the world which they had visited with violence and drenched in blood, and returned not only with booty and looted treasures, but with plants and seeds carefully wrapped and tended to cultivate in their gardens. Plants were part of the display in military triumphs. New varieties of plants were therefore the strange fruits of war. Take the famous general Lucullus, for example, and never mind his drawn-out and difficult campaign in the east. He came back with cherry trees from Pontus, that kingdom of Mithridates, the poison king who Rome so despised. And not too long after that, Pompey the Great came back from his campaigns able to graft a new breed of fig, which was also named after him. So it was that the agrarian writer Columella could state that Italy has learned to produce the fruits of almost the entire world. And perhaps it's clearer now why I said in the beginning that it was part ideology, part pride, and part truth when Varro's father-in-law exclaimed, "Is not Italy so covered with trees that the whole land seems to be an orchard?" Pomona partook in this way in the language of imperialism, but she was the botanical antidote to the battlefield, and the luxurious bounty of her gardens represented the blooming antithesis of bloody war. Through her pruning knife and guarded orchard, Pomona embodies a rustic Roman ideal, the fruitful yield that comes from care, skill, and patience. But she also embodies the elite spirit of maintaining a cultivated estate, not hard, raw toil, but an elegant sort of stewardship. And through her lush and fructuous gifts, she graces life with all the simple good things that make it pleasurable to live. And walled in, safe in her space, content and abundant, she had something to say to seasonality and love as well. So I'll leave you with some advice from Ovid, from his book, The Art of Love, that teaches men, quite cheekily, how to find themselves a woman. With echoes of Pomona, but less sincerity perhaps than her suitor Vertumnus, Ovid provides a strategy of winning over a lady with fruit and all that it represents, but he also advises a little trick. The same trick we saw pulled by those faking elites with their banquets and country fruit houses. Remember that the Via Sacra is the street running through the markets of the Forum in downtown Rome. Ovid says, "I don't tell you to give your mistress expensive gifts. Give little, but of that little, skillfully give what's fitting. When the field is full of riches, when the branches bend with the weight, let the boy bring a gift in a rustic basket. You can say it was sent from your country villa, even though it was bought on the Via Sacra." All is fair in love and war, as they say, and clearly some things never change.